Hello and welcome to another discussion on the Rational National, this time about the Canadian election. I'm joined now by Christo Aivalis. He's a historian and co-host of the podcast Left Turn Canada. Christo, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, an election coming up next week. I already voted. I wonder if you voted. You can tell me that. But so we're going to get into the discussion here on, in particular, how the NDP is doing, as well as you're an NDP member, and I support the NDP in this election. But let's first start with the calling of this election. So a lot of people, I think, I don't know, most people maybe feel that there was no need for an election right now, but Trudeau called the snap election with the intention, I think clearly, of hoping he would secure up a majority based on polling, how he was doing at the time. It looked like he'd be able to hold or potentially win a majority. But that's clearly gone to the side. I'll get to some polling in a second detailing that. But what are your thoughts on Trudeau calling this election, and maybe how that might impact some of voters?
Well, I mean, the conventional wisdom was that it wasn't going to hurt him because all of the provincial elections, most of them, had resulted in a victory for the incumbent party. You know, in BC, there was an election called. It resulted in a NDP majority. In New Brunswick, a conservative minority government turned into a majority. In Newfoundland, the Liberals picked up seats, won a majority. There was that election in Nova Scotia, which resulted in a change, but there wasn't actually a ton of voter movement. And it wasn't necessarily clear that people were mad about the pandemic, and that being the reason why. It seemed to be issues around healthcare and housing, and people just wanted a new government. And so, in a lot of ways, people just expected that it wouldn't make a big difference. But I think a lot of people really thought to themselves and said, look, this government is not 3 years old. It's not 3.5 years old. It's not like Trudeau had to either call it now or 6 months from now, like with John Horgan, where, you know, he could have left it a little bit longer, but he really had to go soon. And it was also the case that none of the legislation he was running on and has been running on would require a new parliament to pass. Because if he wanted to pass his childcare policy, he could do that with NDP support, likely Bloc support as well. If he wanted to pass tax cuts to the rich, he could do that with Conservative support. If he wanted to do, you know, anything to do with like LGBTQ rights, he could do that with the NDP support and likely the Bloc support as well. And so when you add all this up together, I think a lot of people thought to themselves, okay, I'm not necessarily 100% against a pandemic election, but I have to say to myself, like, does this one make sense, right? Given that he's not actually running on anything that you need to do. And he's coming out with policies like paid sick days, like when those could have been passed in that last parliament during the pandemic where workers needed paid sick days. And I think it came off as overly cynical, even in comparison to the early provincial elections we saw.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the results of that in some of the polling right now. So a recent Nanos poll that I just saw today from September 14th shows the Liberals at 31%, a change of -2 from the last election. The Conservatives at 31%, a change of -3 from the last election. The NDP up 5 at 21%, a change from the last election. And PPC at 7%, up 5. Bloc Québécois at 6%, down 2, and Green Party at 4%, down 3. So let's first discuss the top two parties here. So the Liberals and Conservatives potentially down at maybe the lowest point, at least in recent memory, during a federal election. What are your thoughts on this? Are people now waking up to the reality that maybe there's a third option out there and maybe they should begin trying to grow the support of the NDP and, you know, I guess in some cases the PPC if they can win a seat? But people are clearly a little frustrated with the two major parties. And what are your thoughts on why that is?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's been exceptional periods like when the Conservative Party split into the Progressive Conservatives and like the Reform Party. And of course, there was the 2011 election where the NDP finished second. But in general, it's like through broad Canadian history, the Liberal and Conservative parties could be expected to get well over 70%, sometimes 80% of the vote, like between them. And, you know, they would have most people move between those two parties. But in this election, it's like they might struggle to crack 60% or certainly get like 2/3 of the electorate. And I think it shows that a lot of people are frustrated with the status quo. Whether they're frustrated on the left or on the right, they don't feel that the two big parties, are representing their interests, right? And so I think a lot of people are looking to different options.
Hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why it's looking like a minority government. And one of the reasons why, the liberals and conservatives haven't really been able to break away from one another. Because while, earlier in the election, it was true that the liberals were flirting with majority numbers. They were in the mid 30s, way ahead of the conservatives, or they were in the high 30s, 5 or 6 points ahead of the conservatives. Those are the kind of numbers that you need to see for a majority government, usually in federal politics.
Hmm.
And so that movement from the liberals back to the conservatives sort of reverted to that tie. I don't know if that's necessarily a sign that you're going to see a fundamental realignment, because first past the post still kind of ensures that the liberals and conservatives are going to get like 3/4 of all the seats in parliament, even if they're only getting like 60%, 55% of the vote. But it does show a dissatisfaction with the status quo. Whether that manifests in parliament is hard to say, but people want something different, and the main parties aren't giving it to them.
So on that point, what do you think it would take, or is it possible for the NDP to at some point form a government in a first past the post system? Do you think it's possible? What would it take for that to happen?
Yeah, I do think it's possible. I think like in 2011 they came up short, but it clearly showed that they can do it, right? That they can build a coalition. It's going to take greater regional strength. The NDP's got to find some way to win big seats in Quebec again. Like they have to do that. I don't think the NDP can win a majority government or a government without some significant Quebec support. It
Mm.
doesn't necessarily need to be like the 50 some seats they won in Quebec in 2011, but they got to be able to win, a couple dozen seats at least. And then also build strength in Atlantic Canada, and then regain a foothold in like the downtown core of Toronto.
Mm.
But really, I mean, you can see it happen where, if strategic voting remains a reality for a lot of people, if the NDP can assert itself as the non-conservative option and be able to build that broad coalition, it can certainly happen. One challenge is going to be, like here in Ontario, is the vote efficiency there, right? One challenge in Ontario for the Ontario NDP in the last election was that there was a worry that there wasn't going to be enough votes for them in suburbia. So
Mm.
the NDP does need to look at how they can win votes in places like the 905, basically the suburban outskirts around Toronto, which has been a traditional weak spot for the party. If they can do that, however, they can build a broader coalition of victory.
Yeah, and the question is as well, I mean, can they do that without compromising who they are? I mean, as we've seen, when the NDP have formed government at the provincial level, whether it's Ontario, Alberta, BC, there tends to be this move towards neoliberalism once they gain power, which is, I think, disappointing. And people that are, supporters of the NDP are, I imagine at times, worried that if a federal party, NDP, were to take power at some point, would they actually stick to their values, or would they try to, appeal to those middle of the road, I guess, for lack of a better term, voters, the more conservative voters, by being more like the Liberal Party, which then in essence would kind of defeat the purpose of them
Yeah.
forming government. So do you think that's a worry?
I mean, that was probably what Tom Mulcair was trying to do,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and in a different context, it might have worked, right? Like, if he was slightly more likable, if things went a little different, if that election was shorter, Tom Mulcair might have been able to win a minority government. There were times in that election where the NDP was polling in first, even during the writ. Um, it's hard to say exactly what it'll be like, because in many ways there are still distinctions between NDP government neoliberalism and Liberal and Conservative Party neoliberalism.
Hmm.
Some of the things Bob Rae passed, like pay equity, still really haven't been brought back. The NDP governments in the West, nationalized telecom companies and auto insurance companies, something that you don't often see in provinces without NDP governments. And
Hmm.
so there is a difference, but it would be a question of how much does like running a capitalist G7 country constrain you, right? Like
Hmm.
how bold can you be while still baked into the system? Conversely, one argument you could make is that the federal government has more power around things like taxation and spending and debt. And so it's hypothetically the case that while, provincial governments are more constrained in their ability to like spend money,
Mm.
the federal government isn't as much, and they may be able to do some rather important things around that, which is why you've been seeing Singh talk about significant tax increases on the rich and wealthy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.